People care about seabird islands because they are unique communities of plants and animals, and they support populations of birds and animals that often we care about for other reasons.
They're really important players in marine ecosystems, and for anybody who cares about oceans or about marine ecosystems, seabirds are a really important component to that.
A lot of seabirds aren't doing that well, and some of the largest contributors to this endangerment are invasive species and invasive predators in particular.
On an uninvaded island, we see large densities of seabirds, and on some of those islands they breed in their tens or even hundreds of thousands.
Seabirds largely choose to nest and roost on islands because they're refuges from a lot of predators.
Basically what seabirds do is they feed at sea and they feed on fish, and they take that marine nutrient input and fly back to the islands and bring it to island food webs.
It's these islands that are necessary for the survival of seabirds.
If you lose the seabirds, then you lose other endemic species.
Seabird Island is an island on which there are large number of seabirds, and those are usually in colonies, although not always. There are large groups of seabirds that nest there during periods of time when they're producing eggs and raising their chicks, but that are absent from those islands during the rest of the time. Seabird islands are found all over the globe. They range from sub-Antarctic or Antarctic islands all the way up through the tropics, through both the wet and dry equatorial zones, all the way to the polar regions.
We want to keep a close eye on what seabirds are doing because they can tell us so much about the health of marine systems and the health of the climate of the whole planet in general.
Around 1/3 of seabird species are currently listed from threatened to endangered on the World Conservation Union's red list. Some of the largest contributors to this endangerment are invasive species and invasive predators in particular.
Last night the terns arrived at Juandanova for the first time to start breeding, and only one cat remains in this territory, and this is the number of terns that it killed in one night, the first night of their arrival. In fact, not all of them are dead. Some of them were still alive and were just dying when we found them at 2 o'clock in the morning.
There are introduced predators on seabird islands everywhere. An introduced species is a species that arrives in a habitat where it previously wasn't present. The phrase introduced and exotic or non-native are often used interchangeably. Most of the time these are species that are introduced by people, whether that's on purpose or by accidents. An invasive species is a species that was either recently introduced or relatively rare until recently, and that has suddenly become much more abundant and starts having negative impacts. So most introduced species are not invasive. That is, they're kept in check by other factors, but a small proportion of all plant and animal species become invasive and really take over large parts of the vegetation or the habitat into which they're introduced.
Mustelids, mongooses is a good example.
Dogs, cats, rats, the house mice, sheep, rabbits,
The Arctic fox,
deer mice.
invasive ungulates like cattle.
Invasive species really can be such a broad term. Rodents are the ones that are most spread throughout the world. Feral domestic animals are a very difficult situation because people love their dogs and cats, and they often are unable to understand how they could have such a negative impact that they would need to be killed on a large scale.
Islands in general are very important for seabirds because they give the birds safety from mainland-based predators. An island gives the birds sanctuary to breed on the ground during their extended nesting seasons.
Seabirds have evolved basically in the absence of land-based predators in most cases. And so this means they haven't really had the opportunity to evolve defense mechanisms to protect themselves from any sort of land-based predation. The Pacific rat, the smallest species of invasive rat, is like a 65-gram rat, and there's a record of this rat through the course of 2 nights chewing a hole through a Laysan albatross's neck. And the Laysan albatross is a 3-kilogram bird, or nearly 3-kilogram bird. The bird has no defense mechanism. It's not programmed to defend itself. That's why invasive predators can have these profound impacts on island nesting seabirds and really all endemic island fauna.
The rats or mice even can take the eggs, the chicks, and sometimes even the adults of certain species. It's important to remember that rodents make up approximately half of all mammal species worldwide, and the vast majority of them cause no problems at all.
The problem is when species are introduced in places where there really isn't much competition or there aren't very many predators. And in that case, populations can grow very rapidly and start affecting other species.
When rats invade those islands, all the small-bodied birds are preyed upon very quickly and disappear. Only a hardy few can survive, a few big-bodied birds. Even then, there is a drastic reduction in the density of seabirds.
Rodents generally are introduced accidentally through boat crashes, boat wrecks, or just boats mooring near shore. Things like cats generally are introduced by people that, often it's in New Zealand, it's a lighthouse keeper that wanted to bring their cat out, and then the cats go feral.
Arctic fox and red foxes were stocked on islands during the fur days very early on after discovery by the Russians. And stocking of islands with foxes, especially on seabird islands, continued up into the late 1920s. They were stocked for fur. It was very profitable. Through natural propagation, they could result in harvesting of hundreds of foxes only a few years later.
The burrowing activity of these birds, they form long burrows up to 1 metre or even more long, ceases, and the forest begins a process in the absence of that kind of disturbance and without the subsidy of marine nutrients that the birds bring each day to the island. The main effects that we've looked at have been the effects of rat invasions on the below-ground food webs and on soil nutrients. Soil nutrients, once the seabirds have been much reduced, at least by the rats, is to drop significantly. The food web is significantly altered, particularly numbers of all levels of the trophic webs below ground are much reduced when rats are present.
Typically, rodents are omnivorous and primarily eat vegetation, seeds, plants, and invertebrates.
It's because of the endangered plants that this area was set aside as a natural area reserve, and this is one of the main species. This is Sesbania tomentosa, which is a legume. It's an endangered species, and this is one of the species that is recovering out here on this site. Here you can see some flowers that have got most of the petals and other parts eaten. Here you can see an intact flower, and this is probably damaged by rats that are chewing into the flowers to get access to the nectar, and of course once they've done that, these plants aren't going to set seed anymore.
It's quite likely that rats on our islands have led to the extinction through eating seeds of at least 2 canopy tree species, and we see that those are a lot less common on islands that have been invaded by rats.
Seabirds can have profound impacts on soil nutrient concentrations and plant community composition.
The birds actively concentrate nutrients from the marine environment and deposit them in the form of guano.
Guano, which is in part nitrogen and phosphorus.
And nitrogen and phosphorus are good fertilizers. They are what you find in commercially bought fertilizer.
Which then favors the rampant growth of plants.
The environment that the seabirds create often supports species that wouldn't otherwise be there. So for example, some plant species are found only on seabird islands or are commonly found on seabird islands because they thrive in that kind of very high nutrients, high disturbance environments.
Yeah, there's a huge amount of variation among seabird species in terms of their effect on plants. Part of that is due to behavioral differences among species. Certain species nest on the ground, others nest in trees, some burrow under the ground, and because of those particular nesting habitats, there's quite a big variation in their impact. And then on top of that, there's differences in body size that can affect the rate of guano input and the amount of trampling that occurs around nesting territories, especially for ground nesting birds. And it's also possible that differences in diet and foraging strategies and the type of foods that birds are bringing back to the colony can also influence the impact that they have, particularly in terms of nutrient addition to these colony areas.
Once the disturbance that the seabirds have caused to those islands ceases, there's a rapid regrowth of an understory and a lot more litter accumulation on the forest floor. As a result, new habitats form, new species are favoured.
We learned pretty early on that the seabirds were providing not just guano to the soil, which of course enriches plants when they grow, but they also bring in eggs and chicks from their nests that sometimes die for a variety of reasons. And those chick carcasses also become kind of a conduit into the food web for scavenging beetles and lizards and a whole bunch of other terrestrial animals that, that eat those chick and egg carcasses.
The other important factor is that a lot of animals are found on these islands for the same reason as the seabirds are found there, which is that they don't have very many predators.
So you actually can support much larger, more dense populations of animals on seabird islands. We often think about oceans and islands as separate ecosystems, and when you start looking at it at particularly seabird islands, we begin to realize that islands and ocean ecosystems are very, very tightly integrated, that both ecosystems are really dependent on the other.
The best way to deal with invasive species is to not introduce them in the first place. If you can't prevent species from making it onto the islands, then they either have to be kept at low levels or they have to be eradicated.
People that have been involved in eradications have identified 3 biological tenets that every eradication project needs to consider. Remove the animal, the invading species, faster than it can reproduce. Put every animal at risk, preventing the reinvasion of areas that you've cleared of the invading species.
And finally, if you do manage to eradicate them, then there's still considerable work in restoring the environment back to where it was. The methods used for eradicating species depend, of course, on what kind of species are being eradicated. The most widespread predator is rat species. There are 3 different rat species that are commonly found throughout the planet.
The first step is usually finding a place that has the invasive species present and documenting that it in fact is causing a problem. So after the feasibility stage, you get into the planning process. Typically you'll see operations, especially larger ones, spend years to plan every detail of the operation and have that plan vetted through outside reviewers and stakeholders. Once the planning process is done, you move into the operational phase. The eradication operation itself is usually condensed into a very short time frame, but at the same time, it's an extremely complicated procedure and logistical feat because most of these places are extremely remote. Early on, eradications were actually accidental. Land managers initially were trying to control rodent populations during, say, nesting season of birds. A couple of these operations accidentally resulted in the removal of rats, which was previously thought to be impossible on islands. The next step was to kind of work out a systematic approach to expose all the animals on a routine basis. They did this by cutting a network of trails or establishing what we call bait stations. Inside these bait stations, toxicants would be placed, generally anticoagulants. Typically the baits are extruded pellets. They have a long delay between ingestion of a lethal dose and the symptoms that occur as a result of that. Rodents will eat a very small amount of something first before they wholeheartedly take that as a food item, and they can detect very small amounts of things that are not good for them, and so they'll avoid that thereafter. The next step was hand broadcast of toxicants. This was conducted by having folks walk along transects, and at intervals they would distribute bait directly on the ground. This gave managers the idea of distributing bait from a helicopter. Over time, this progressed with specialized equipment, a broadcast spreader bucket that would fan the bait out in an even pattern, differential GPS to maintain very accurate flight lines to ensure that all animals' territories had sufficient bait in it to expose them to the lethal doses. Once that eradication process is done, post-operation begins, and that usually entails efficacy monitoring to ensure that, in fact, all rodents have been removed from the island. Often, in addition to that, you'll see ecological monitoring to measure the recovery or the attainment of the original goals and objectives. Some operations often ensure that the toxicants used have not moved in any deleterious way through the environment. Non-target species monitoring is often very important. That could entail searching for carcasses of animals that were not intended to be killed, or counting the numbers of animals before and after to see if there are differences.
They want to make sure that we are doing like a human treatment of the animals, from the goats and also the cats. For that reason, we are using more the cage traps for the cats.
People like animals, biologists in particular. Land managers are often assigned the task of protecting native biodiversity, native species, and so we often find ourselves in the position of making very difficult decisions to undertake such projects. In those situations, there's unfortunately going to be a loser. It's either going to be the native species or the introduced species. So one of them has to be removed in order for the other one to persist. To leave the invasive species there, that's the decision to allow the native species to potentially go extinct.
The key thing that needs to be done first is to set some clear goals for what a restored island might look like. And there's quite a range of community expectations about how a restored island might look. The ability to eradicate rats from islands is fairly straightforward. It's been achieved for islands many times the size of the islands that we're working on. However, many of them face the prospect of reinvasion because they're near shipping channels, so that requires constant quarantining of those islands. Then, if there are particular seabirds that are desired to be reintroduced on the island, that might make mean, at least for several years, installing artificial bird burrows and bringing near-fledged chicks from neighbouring islands across so that they might orient themselves on those points.
Seabirds have a couple of characteristics that make it quite difficult to get them to basically respond on their own or recover on their own after predators are eradicated. The first one is what scientists call natal philopatry, and basically that just means that seabirds are genetically programmed to return to breed where they hatched, or at least most seabirds are. The idea of chick translocations, as for seabird restoration, is to take a chick before it's imprinted on its natal colony and transfer it to a restoration site. And the idea is that they'll come back to the restoration site to breed because they're programmed to breed where they were hatched. The second characteristic that seabirds have that makes them difficult to restore is their coloniality. Really, they nest in these large aggregations, and they use the presence of other seabird individuals to indicate to them that that's a good place to breed. So when predators are introduced, it basically means that other seabirds or prospecting seabirds won't come to this place to nest. And so to overcome that particular characteristic, what people do are they put decoys shaped like the focal seabird species. And they also can put mirrors up as well, and those attract prospecting birds to the site. The other thing that's often used are the playback of vocalizations, because seabirds also use auditory cues as cues for quality breeding habitats.
The ability to restore islands is a growing initiative worldwide, and I think there are opportunities for people to learn from others' experience in a range of countries and a range of environments.
I think the challenge is for invasive species in the future is going to come down to gaining public support for such projects.
I think the key thing that the public could do that would help would be to be involved in setting goals for how they would see a restored island. As long as that's a dialogue and people can be told what is likely to be realistic over a particular period, prospects are quite bright for public involvement in restoration of a range of islands.
At least in the past 10 or 15 years, the community in Bahia de Los Angeles, which is the main fishing community near the bay where the islands I've studied are, they have a really active group of people who are working on island conservation. They put up a lot of signage on the islands, on the main landing spots, to try to encourage kayakers, other ecotourists, sailboat captains who are coming into a particular bay on an island to really be careful as they come on the islands to make sure they're not transporting any unwanted species.
We are trying to involve all the whole community. Well, we have more than 10 years working on the region, so we develop a really good relation with the fishermen. We show them the importance of the islands for them, and also for us and from everyone. And they understand the importance of the island, so they support us. The response for the people is, right now, is really good, the response of the restoration of the island.
There's so many people on this coast these days affecting the ecology of the New England coast in so many ways. Some of those people have to be, in my view, actively engaged in conservation. The whole idea of a puffin is a very appealing bird. I think it's appealing because, like other upright, vertical walking birds, they remind us of ourselves. And it is an umbrella that permits us to do research with other species that, for their own reasons, are also appealing, but not as readily so as is the puffin. The puffin engages people just by its appearance. It's just a marvelous, well-adapted animal. And it needs a clean marine environment if it's going to survive. And because of that, we can point to the puffin and say, if you care about this little bird, you should care about the oceans as well, because it needs healthy oceans if it's going to survive. It's really a rallying point. It's a bird that everybody can be interested in. They can follow at whatever level of interest they have, and we can engage a broader public because the puffin is so appealing. Even though they nest on remote islands, things that people are doing all over the world are affecting these islands and affecting the marine systems in which the puffins live. For example, eastern egg rock, where there are now 7,000 seabirds breeding, is just a 7-acre island, and it's only 17 feet above the highest tide. With melting of the polar ice caps and the potential for the ocean to rise, we're very concerned that ocean level rise will flood the nesting habitat around the edges of the island.
Simply changes in ocean current, surface temperature of the ocean, the pH of the ocean, which will have impacts on ocean food webs from basically what we would call the bottom up, from phytoplankton all the way up through the food web.
Changes in the precipitation patterns, changes in extreme events like storms are all likely to affect the islands themselves. And on top of that, because seabirds often travel such very long distances, they are vulnerable to changes in marine environments, even in places that are a long way away from their home.
We're concerned that warming waters can change the kinds of fish that are in the area. We're already seeing some southern types of fish moving in to the Gulf of Maine that we haven't seen before. And we may see some of the primary food fish moving away from the islands, and the seabirds won't be able to commute far enough to where those food supplies are.
Even though there's still new islands being invaded, people have started to catch on to the fact that these seabird predators are incredibly damaging, and they've started to do things about it. I think what makes the future for seabird islands bright is that people are starting to realize just how important these islands are. They're starting to realize that there are ways of keeping them safe, of managing them, and often of restoring them, and that requires people to get involved in their own islands. And that's happening everywhere, and the collaborations that are happening are what are really allowing this to be successful. The collaborations between scientists and managers and local people who take pride in their own islands.